The wrapper slipped from Adaeze's trembling fingers as she stood in the doorway of what used to be her bedroom. Inside, Ngozi sat at her dressing table, trying on her gold earrings, the ones Chike had given her on their wedding night. The maid's reflection in the mirror wore a smile that made Adaeze's blood run cold. "Those belong to me," Adaeze whispered, her voice barely audible over the pounding of her heart. Ngozi turned slowly, the earrings still dangling from her lobes, catching the afternoon light streaming through the window. "Do they?" she asked, her tone stripped of the deference that had colored every word she'd spoken for the past 2 years. "I'm not so sure anymore. After all, Chike gave them to me just last night." But this confrontation was 3 years in the making, and the story of how a housemaid came to sit in a wealthy woman's chair, wearing her jewelry and sleeping in her bed, began on a humid afternoon in 2003, when Adaeze first returned to her father's compound in Rumokuro. Adaeze had been the pride of her family, the first daughter to attend university in Port Harcourt, returning home with not just a degree in business administration, but also a husband. Chike owned 3 palm oil processing factories and had plans to expand. The wedding had been the talk of Rivers State, with guests arriving from as far as Owerri and Calabar. Her late father's compound, already one of the finest in the village with its sprawling main house and separate boys' quarters, had been decorated with the most expensive fabrics. The band had played until dawn. Now, 6 months into her marriage, Adaeze needed help managing the household. Between learning to navigate her role as Chike's wife, helping with the business ledgers, and managing the social obligations that came with their status, she was overwhelmed. Her mother-in-law, Mama Nunso, had suggested hiring a housemaid from the village, someone young and trainable who would be grateful for the opportunity. That was how Ngozi arrived, recommended by a distant cousin who knew her family. She was 19, thin as a cassava stick, with eyes that stayed fixed on the ground when she spoke. Her father was known in the neighboring village. Her father had drunk himself to death, leaving her mother with 6 children and no land. Ngozi had only completed secondary school before the money ran out. "Thank you, Ma," she'd said, when Adaeze showed her the small room in the boys' quarters. "God will bless you for your kindness." Adaeze felt a warmth in her chest at those words. She would give this girl opportunities, teach her skills, maybe even help her go back to school eventually. It was what her father would have wanted, using their blessings to lift others. For the first 3 months, Ngozi was perfect. She woke before dawn to sweep the compound, prepared breakfast without being asked, and washed clothes until her knuckles were raw. She called Adaeze's sister with such affection that it made Adaeze smile. Even Chike commented on how lucky they were to find such a dedicated worker. But Ngozi's perfection was a carefully constructed mask. Every night, lying on her thin mattress in the boys' quarters, she stared at the ceiling and imagined what it would be like to sleep in the main house, in that big bed with the soft mattress and mosquito net that looked like something from a Nollywood film. She watched Adaeze move through life with such ease. The way she laughed freely, how she never checked price tags at the market, how Chike looked at her like she was made of sunlight. The seed of envy that had been planted the day Ngozi arrived began to grow roots, dark and deep. It wasn't fair. What had Adaeze done to deserve this life? She'd simply been born into the right family. If Ngozi had been given the same advantages, wouldn't she be the one wearing gold jewelry and giving orders? The turning point came on a Saturday afternoon when Chike returned from a business trip to Lagos with gifts. For Adaeze, there was a new wrapper, real Italian lace that cost more than Ngozi's family would see in 6 months. For Ngozi, there was nothing, not even acknowledgement that she'd worked extra hours to prepare his favorite or her soup. That night, Ngozi made her first visit to Dibia Okorofo's compound at the edge of the village. The old man was known for 2 things, his powerful juju and his willingness to use it for the right price. She'd saved every naira Adaeze had given her for the past 3 months. "I want what belongs to me," Ngozi told him, her voice steady despite her racing heart. The Dibia's eyes were milky with cataracts, but they seemed to see right through her. "And what belongs to you, my daughter? The life I should have had if God had been fair. He gave her a powder. Instructions were specific. Mix it into Adaeze's food once a week, never more. It wouldn't kill her, he assured, but it would make her weak, make her sick enough that she couldn't fulfill her duties as a wife. The rest, he said, would be up to Ngozi's cleverness. The powder worked exactly as promised. Within 3 weeks, Adaeze began experiencing fatigue that no amount of rest could cure. The turning point came on a Saturday afternoon when Chike returned from a business trip to Lagos with gifts. For Adaeze, there was a new wrapper, real Italian lace that cost more than Ngozi's family would see in 6 months. For Ngozi, there was nothing, not even acknowledgement that she'd worked extra hours to prepare his favorite oha soup. That night, Ngozi made her first visit to Dibia Okorofo's compound at the edge of the village. The old man was known for 2 things, his powerful juju and his willingness to use it for the right price. She'd saved every naira Adaeze had given her for the past 3 months. I want what belongs to me, Ngozi told him, her voice steady despite her racing heart. The Dibia's eyes were milky with cataracts, but they seemed to see right through her. And what belongs to you, my daughter? The life I should have had if God had been fair. He gave her a powder. Instructions were specific. Mix it into Adaeze's food once a week, never more. It wouldn't kill her, he assured, but it would make her weak, make her sick enough that she couldn't fulfill her duties as a wife. The rest, he said, would be up to Ngozi's cleverness. The powder worked exactly as promised. Within 3 weeks, Adaeze began experiencing fatigue that no amount of rest could cure. Her monthly cycle became irregular, then stopped altogether. She visited the hospital in Port Harcourt twice, but the doctors found nothing wrong. They suggested stress, adjusting to married life. Perhaps she was trying too hard to conceive. But Ngozi's plan went deeper than poison. She understood that stealing Adaeze's life required more than just making her sick. It required destroying her reputation, her relationships, the very foundation of her position in the household. She started small. At the market, she would mention to the other women how Adaeze sometimes received phone calls late at night, how she'd heard her whispering. The women's eyes would widen with the implication. She told Mama Nonso that Adaeze had been rude about her cooking, that she'd complained about village traditions being backward. She made sure to be overheard saying that Adaeze had thrown away food, a grave offense in a community where many still struggled. Each lie was calculated, plausible, and delivered with such convincing concern that no one questioned Ngozi's motives. After all, she was just a poor housemaid. What could she possibly gain from speaking ill of her employer? Meanwhile, Adaeze's health continued to deteriorate. She lost weight. Her skin, once glowing, became dull and dry. The worst part was the inability to conceive. In their culture, in their community, a wife's primary duty was to bear children. Month after month passed with no pregnancy, and the whispers grew louder. Chike tried to be supportive, but Adaeze could see the worry in his eyes. Her mother was less subtle. In my day, Mama Nonso said during one visit, if a wife couldn't give her husband children within the first year, there were remedies, traditional remedies. It was Ngozi who suggested so carefully, so innocently, that perhaps Adaeze should see a Dibia instead of these Western doctors who clearly didn't understand. My aunt had the same problem, she lied, and Dibia Okorofo cured her. Now she has 5 children. Desperate and weakened, Adaeze agreed. The Dibia gave her herbs to drink, performed rituals, and charged fees that made even Chike wince. Of course, nothing worked. How could it, when the same man was being paid by Ngozi to ensure Adaeze remained barren? 18 months into her employment, Ngozi made her boldest move yet. She had learned Chike's patterns: when he came home late from the factory, when he was stressed about business, when he drank just enough palm wine to lower his guard. She had learned how to be present without being noticed, how to brush against him accidentally, how to look at him with something that hovered between innocence and invitation. One night, when Adaeze was visiting her mother's family in another town, Ngozi brought Chike his dinner wearing a wrapper tied just a bit lower than appropriate. She'd put on some weight from eating proper meals, and her body had filled out in ways that hadn't escaped Chike's notice. "Sir, I can give you what she cannot," Ngozi said, her voice quiet but clear. Chike should have sent her away. He should have remembered his vows, his love for his wife, his honor. But he was a man who'd been married for 2 years without children, whose mother reminded him daily that his lineage was at stake, who'd watched his wife waste away without understanding why. And Ngozi was there, willing, looking at him like he was everything she'd ever wanted. His fall was quick and shameful. 3 months later, Ngozi announced she was pregnant. She told Chike first, privately, with tears in her eyes. "I'm so sorry, sir. I know it was wrong. I'll leave. I'll go back to my village. No one will know." But Chike, trapped between guilt and a twisted sense of hope, made a decision that would haunt him. He went to his mother. Mama Nonso saw the pregnancy not as a scandal, but as a solution. Here was proof that the problem wasn't with her son, it was with Adaeze. Here was a child, a grandchild, a continuation of their lineage. And Ngozi, despite being a mere housemaid, had proven herself fertile and obedient. The campaign to remove Adaeze from the house began with surgical precision. Mama Nonso arrived at the compound and declared that Adaeze's continued barrenness was a sign of spiritual problems. She insisted that Adaeze return to her mother's compound for cleansing while they sorted out the situation. Chike, drowning in guilt and manipulated by both women, agreed. Adaeze, weak and confused, was packed off to her mother's people in Elele. She took only what she could carry. Ngozi watched from the window of the boys' quarters, her hand resting on her still flat belly, and smiled. Within 2 weeks of Adaeze's departure, Ngozi moved into the main house. Mama Nonso arranged a quiet traditional marriage, nothing like Adaeze's elaborate ceremony, but enough to make it legitimate in the village's eyes. Chike went through the motions like a man in a trance, and if he sometimes woke in the middle of the night reaching for someone who wasn't there, he pushed the feeling down with rationalizations about duty and lineage. Ngozi wore Adaeze's wrappers, slept in her bed, and used her pots. She gave birth to a son and named him Chinedu, God leads, because she believed the gods had led her to this life she deserved. For 3 years, Ngozi played her role perfectly. But the thing about stolen lives is that they never quite fit. The villagers who had once whispered about Adaeze now whispered about Ngozi, about how she'd risen too fast, about whether the child was truly Chike's, about the strange circumstances of Adaeze's disappearance. Chike's business began to struggle in ways it never had before, and Ngozi discovered that having everything you thought you wanted doesn't fill the emptiness inside if it wasn't truly yours to begin with. Meanwhile, in Elele, something remarkable was happening. Away from Ngozi's position, Adaeze began to recover. Her strength returned, her cycle normalized, her mind, free from the fog of constant illness, began to clear and question. Why had she gotten sick only at home? Why had she recovered so quickly once she left? An old woman named Mama Ejiro, who sold vegetables at Elele Market, noticed Adaeze one day and pulled her aside. "I know your face," she said. "You are Adaeze from Rumuokoro, the one whose maid stole your life." The story came tumbling out. Mama Ejiro's niece worked in the same market as Ngozi had back in Rumuokoro. She'd seen Ngozi visiting Dibia Okorafo, heard her boasting to another girl about her plans. But who would believe a market woman against a man's mother and his new pregnant wife?
Adaeze felt rage kindle in her chest, but it was cold and calculating. She wouldn't rush back in anger. She would do this properly, the way her father had taught her to handle business, with evidence, witnesses, and the backing of respected community members. She spent 6 months building her case. She found the Dibia's assistant who, for the right price, confirmed Ngozi's visits and the nature of the poisons purchased. She gathered testimonies from women in the market who'd watched Ngozi systematically spread lies. She even located the doctor in Port Harcourt who treated her, who confirmed that her symptoms were consistent with chronic low-level poisoning. Chike's younger sister, Obiageli, had never believed the story about Adaeze. When Adaeze sent word through a trusted friend, Obiageli came to Elele immediately. The young woman wept when she saw how healthy Adaeze looked, how different from the wasted figure who'd left Rumokoro. "She's wearing your jewelry," Obiageli said, her voice shaking with rage. "She parades around the compound like she owns it, and my brother, he's like a ghost of himself." They planned carefully. The New Yam Festival was approaching, the biggest celebration of the year, when the entire community gathered to give thanks for the harvest. It was the one day when the elders convened publicly, when justice could be demanded before the whole village. On the morning of the festival, Adaeze returned to Rumokoro. She arrived not weak and broken, but dressed in her finest wrapper, her head held high, accompanied by Obiageli, Mama Ijiro, the Dibia's assistant, and 3 respected elders from Elele who'd agreed to speak on her behalf. The confrontation in the bedroom was just the beginning. Ngozi's shock at seeing Adaeze healthy and strong quickly turned to panic when she realized she wasn't alone. "You're supposed to be sick," Ngozi whispered, backing away from the dressing table. "You're supposed to be dying," Adaeze finished. "Yes, I imagine that would have been convenient for you." The trial before the village elders lasted 3 hours. One by one, witnesses came forward. The Dibia's assistant described the poisons, the frequency of Ngozi's visits, the specific instructions she'd given. Market women testified about the lies Ngozi had spread. The doctor from Port Harcourt presented his findings about Adaeze's mysterious illness and remarkable recovery. Ngozi tried to deny everything, tears streaming down her face, clutching her young son to her chest. But when Dibia Okora for himself was brought before the council, threatened with exposure of far worse crimes if he didn't speak truthfully, he confirmed it all. Chike sat among the crowd, his face buried in his hands. His mother, for once, was silent. The judgment was swift and brutal as tradition demanded. Ngozi was stripped of everything, the title of wife, the jewelry, the fine wrappers, even the money she'd saved. She was declared a witch and a thief, her name to be spoken as a warning to others. She would return to her mother's village in disgrace, barred from ever setting foot in Rumokoro again. The question of the child hung in the air like smoke. He was innocent in all this, but he was also the product of Ngozi's scheme. After hours of deliberation, the elders decided the boy would remain with Chike and be raised knowing the truth of his mother's crimes so he might learn from them and become an honorable man despite his origins. Ngozi screamed as they took her son from her arms. She cursed Adaeze, cursed the village, cursed God himself for what she called unfairness. But her curses fell on deaf ears. She'd gambled everything on his stolen life and lost it all. As for Chike, he knelt before Adaeze in front of the entire village as the elders commanded and begged forgiveness. He said, "I was weak. I betrayed you in the worst way possible. I don't deserve your mercy."
Adaeze looked down at him. This man who'd once promised to honor her, who'd failed her so completely, and felt a complex tangle of emotions. Anger, yes. Hurt that would take years to heal, but also pity and a deep weariness. Revenge wouldn't undo what had been done. Bitterness wouldn't restore what had been lost. "I forgive you," she said finally, and the words felt like setting down a heavy stone. But forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. We'll speak more about what comes next, but not here, not now. Whether she would remain his wife was a question for another day. For now, it was enough to stand before her community vindicated, her name cleared, her dignity restored. 2 years later, travelers passing through Ngozi's mother's village would sometimes see a thin woman walking in the cassava fields, her back bent, her hands rough with labor. She never married, no respectable man would have her after the story spread. She lived with her aging mother, doing the hardest work for the smallest coins. She'd stolen a life and lost her own in the process. The girl who'd once slept in Adaeze's bed now slept on a mat on the floor, and every night before sleep came, she thought about the gold earrings that had never really been hers. Meanwhile, Adaeze did eventually conceive, twin daughters born healthy and strong. She and Chike rebuilt their marriage slowly, brick by careful brick, though it would never be quite what it was before. She raised Ngozi's son alongside her own children, never speaking ill of his mother to him, but ensuring he understood the difference between envy and ambition, between taking and earning. And once a year, on the anniversary of the New Yam festival that had changed everything, Adaeze would send a basket of provisions to Ngozi through an intermediary, not out of weakness, but because she understood something Ngozi never would, that true power lies not in what you can take from others, but in what you choose to give, even to those who least deserve it. The maid who stole Adaeze's life taught Adaeze that karma doesn't always strike like lightning. Sometimes it works slowly, meticulously, ensuring that what you take through betrayal can never truly be yours, and that what is genuinely yours can never truly be stolen, only temporarily borrowed, and ultimately returned, often with interest.